she slid the divorce papers across the dinner table on his birthday. But what she didn't know was that her poor husband, the man she was leaving to marry her arrogant boss at the multi-billion-dollar bank where she worked, was actually the trillionaire who owned the entire institution. Rebecca Martinez had spent 3 years climbing the corporate ladder at Sterling Global Bank, but she'd spent those same 3 years looking down on the quiet, modest man who came home every night in worn jeans and drove a 15-year-old sedan. Her lover, the pompous James Wellington III, flaunted his executive vice president title and corner office, but he was merely an employee of the empire her husband secretly controlled. Tonight, as Thomas Reed sat before a homemade cake he'd baked himself, his wife announced she was leaving him for a real man with actual ambition. But she had no idea that the signature she demanded on those papers would trigger a chain of events that would bankrupt her entire family and leave the man she thought was her upgrade homeless on the streets. The woman who thought she was trading up from poverty to power was actually abandoning a throne. But the emperor she'd dismissed as a pauper was about to remove his disguise. How could a bank executive not recognize that the janitor she'd married owned the very floors she walked on? What had Thomas been doing living as a poor man when he controlled more wealth than most nations? And what would a trillionaire whose heart had just been shattered on his birthday do to the people who'd betrayed him? The Trillionaire's Revelation Part 1, The Birthday Betrayal. The cake sat on the kitchen table, chocolate with vanilla frosting, slightly lopsided because Thomas Reed had never quite mastered the art of even layers. But he'd tried. He always tried. The single candle in the center flickered in the draft from the apartment's poorly sealed windows, casting dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper that Rebecca had complained about for the better part of 2 years. But Thomas had always said they couldn't afford anything better. "I can't do this anymore," Rebecca said, but her voice carried none of the trembling uncertainty that usually accompanied life-changing declarations. She stood by the refrigerator in her tailored Armani suit, the one that had cost more than their monthly rent, and her diamond bracelet caught the light, but Thomas recognized it as the gift James Wellington had given her last month, thinking he'd been too naive to notice. Thomas looked up from the cake he'd spent 3 hours preparing, but he didn't speak. Not yet. His hands, calloused from years of maintaining the fiction he'd built around himself, rested calmly on the chipped formica table, but his mind was already calculating the implications of what was about to happen. "I'm leaving you, Thomas," Rebecca continued, but this time she pulled a manila folder from her leather briefcase, the expensive one James had bought her for Christmas. "I'm marrying James. He's everything you're not. Successful, ambitious, rich." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade, but Thomas simply nodded, his expression neutral, betraying nothing of the empire that existed beneath his carefully constructed persona of mediocrity. He'd built Sterling Global Bank from nothing 20 years ago, starting with a single investment that had multiplied into a financial dynasty controlling assets worth over $800 billion. But he'd hidden it all behind shell corporations, trusts, and a small army of lawyers who ensured his name never appeared on any public documents. "I've already talked to a lawyer," Rebecca said, but she was pacing now, her Louboutin heels clicking against the linoleum floor that Thomas had installed himself to maintain the illusion. "You'll get nothing, obviously. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you'll leave with nothing. That's only fair." Thomas finally spoke, but his voice was soft, almost gentle. "When did you stop loving me?" Rebecca's face hardened, but there was something almost triumphant in her expression, as if she'd been waiting for permission to unleash words she'd been rehearsing. "I never loved you, Thomas. I married you because I thought you'd amount to something. You talked such a big game when we met, all those ideas about business and investments, but look at you now. You're 42 years old and you stock shelves at a warehouse for minimum wage. What she didn't know, but what Thomas could have told her, was that he owned the warehouse, along with the entire logistics company that operated it, and 17 others like it across the country. He'd taken the job there 3 years ago, shortly after marrying Rebecca, because he'd wanted to understand his workers' lives, but also because he'd needed to maintain the fiction that would test whether his new wife loved him or his money. Now he had his answer, but it cut deeper than he'd expected. "James makes more in a month than you make in a year," Rebecca continued, but she was pulling the divorce papers from the folder now, setting them on the table next to the birthday cake. "He has a future. He's about to be promoted to Senior Executive Vice President at Sterling Global Bank. Do you know what that means? He'll be making decisions that affect billions of dollars." Thomas did know what it meant, but probably not in the way Rebecca intended. He knew because he'd personally blocked James Wellington's last 3 promotion requests, having identified the man as a corporate parasite who sexually harassed junior staff, embezzled from expense accounts, and took credit for other people's work. But Thomas had let him remain employed specifically to see how the man would behave with rope to hang himself. He hadn't expected that rope to be tied around his marriage, but life had a way of writing its own stories. "I need you to sign these tonight," Rebecca said, but she was checking her watch now, the Cartier that James had bought her last week. "James is taking me to Le Bernardin for a late dinner. It costs $500 per person, but that's pocket change to him. Unlike you, he knows how to treat a woman properly." Thomas picked up the pen Rebecca had placed on top of the papers, but he didn't open the folder yet. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca sighed, but her impatience was barely concealed. "Make it quick. Your family, your parents, your brother Marcus, they all borrowed money from me over the years, but you never thought it was strange that a warehouse worker could lend out $40,000 here, $30,000 there." For the first time, Rebecca's certainty flickered, but she recovered quickly. "You probably got those payday loans like the idiot you are, but that's not my problem anymore. My father's restaurant, my mother's medical bills, Marcus's law school, those were investments in my future, not yours. You were just the ATM that didn't know when to stop dispensing." Thomas opened the folder, but he read through the divorce papers carefully, noting that Rebecca's lawyer had indeed crafted an agreement that would leave him with nothing. Not that she understood how impossible that actually was. Community property laws were tricky things, but they only applied to assets that the court knew existed. "There's going to be a board meeting tomorrow at Sterling Global Bank," Thomas said, but he was signing the papers now, his signature flowing across the page, with the kind of practiced elegance that seemed at odds with his supposedly simple life. "Something about a major restructuring. You might want to pay attention to what happens there." Rebecca laughed, but it was a cruel sound, sharp and dismissive. "Why would I care about some boring corporate meeting, unless they're finally firing dead weight like the mailroom clerks and janitors, but that doesn't affect people at my level." "I suppose not," Thomas agreed, but he was already planning the calls he would make as soon as Rebecca left, the orders he would give that would reshape not just Sterling Global Bank, but the entire financial sector that had grown comfortable in its complacency. Rebecca snatched the signed papers from the table, but she didn't even look at them before stuffing them back into her briefcase. "James is waiting in his Tesla downstairs. I'll send someone for my things tomorrow, but honestly, there's nothing in this dump worth keeping." She turned toward the door, but Thomas spoke one more time. "Rebecca?" She glanced back, but her hand was already on the doorknob. "What?" "Happy birthday to me," he said quietly, but there was something in his eyes now, something that might have warned her if she'd been paying attention, that the man she was leaving wasn't quite what he seemed. But Rebecca was already gone. but the sound of her heels echoing down the stairwell was like a countdown to something she couldn't yet imagine. Thomas sat alone with his lopsided birthday cake, but he didn't eat any of it. Instead, he pulled out the encrypted phone he kept hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, the one Rebecca had never found in 3 years of marriage, and made the first call. "David, it's time. Activate Protocol Omega, but I want every step documented. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9. Make sure every member receives the full disclosure package by midnight tonight. Yes, all of it. Every subsidiary, every hidden asset, every shell corporation. The world is about to meet the real owner of Sterling Global Bank, but more importantly, so are 2 people who forgot that betrayal always carries a price." He ended the call, but he made 6 more before the night was over, each one setting in motion a cascade of events that would remake the lives of everyone who'd underestimated him. The cake's single candle had burned down to nothing, but Thomas Reed was just beginning to burn everything else. Part 2. The Empire Hidden in Plain Sight. 15 years earlier, but in what felt like another lifetime, Thomas Reed had been a 27-year-old mathematics prodigy who dropped out of MIT during his doctoral program, but not because he couldn't handle the academic rigor. He'd left because he'd discovered something his professors couldn't teach him, that the global financial system was built on inefficiencies so profound that someone with the right algorithms could exploit them to create wealth on an unprecedented scale. His first investment had been $12,000, everything he'd saved from 3 years of working as a programmer, but he'd turned it into $2 million in 6 months by identifying arbitrage opportunities in international currency markets that existed for only microseconds. The algorithms he'd written could execute thousands of trades per second, but they operated in the gaps between human perception and digital reality, making money while other people were still processing information. Within 2 years, he'd turned those $2 million into $200 million, but he'd learned something crucial. Wealth attracted attention, and attention destroyed the anonymity he needed to operate. So he'd created Sterling Global Bank as a front, but he'd built it specifically to look like just another regional financial institution, nothing special, nothing that would attract scrutiny from regulators or rivals. Behind that unremarkable facade, but hidden within layers of legal structures so complex that even forensic accountants would need years to unravel them, Thomas had built an empire. Sterling Global Bank wasn't just a bank, but rather the visible tip of a massive financial iceberg that included real estate portfolios worth billions, technology companies developing cutting-edge AI, pharmaceutical firms researching breakthrough treatments, and media companies that shaped public opinion across 3 continents. By the time he was 35, but still operating completely behind the scenes, Thomas Reed controlled assets worth more than most Fortune 500 companies, but his name appeared nowhere on any public registry. The CEO of Sterling Global Bank was a carefully selected figurehead named Patricia Chen, a brilliant banker who knew exactly who she worked for, but who maintained the fiction that the bank's ownership was distributed among various institutional investors and private equity funds. The truth that only 7 people in the world knew with absolute certainty, was that Thomas Reed owned 97.3% of Sterling Global Bank through a Byzantine structure of trusts, offshore holdings, and interlocking corporate entities that would take a team of lawyers a decade to fully map. He'd built this fortress of secrecy for 2 reasons, but both had been challenged by what happened 3 years ago when he met Rebecca Martinez at a charity fundraiser where he'd been volunteering as a bartender, another one of his projects to understand how normal people lived. Rebecca had been a junior analyst at Sterling Global Bank then, but she was brilliant with numbers and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read market trends. Thomas had been genuinely attracted to her intelligence, but he'd also wanted to know if someone could love him for himself, rather than for the billions he controlled. So he'd presented himself as Thomas Reed, warehouse worker and aspiring entrepreneur, but he'd kept his wealth completely hidden. When they'd dated, but when she'd seemed to fall for his personality and his mind rather than his bank account, he'd thought he'd found something real. The wedding had been small, but Rebecca had complained it wasn't grand enough. The apartment had been modest, but she'd said it was embarrassing. The used car he'd driven had been reliable, but she'd called it humiliating. Still, Thomas had maintained the fiction, but he'd told himself that Rebecca just needed time to understand that money wasn't everything, that their love was more important than material possessions. But as he'd learned over 3 years of increasingly bitter arguments and Rebecca's not quite hidden affair with James Wellington, she'd never loved him at all. She'd loved the person she'd thought he might become, but she'd despised the person he'd actually presented himself as being. The irony, but the beautiful, terrible irony that Thomas was about to unleash, was that the man she was leaving him for was his employee, someone he could fire with a single phone call, but he wasn't going to stop at just firing James Wellington. That would be too simple, but simplicity had never been Thomas's style. Part 3. The morning the world shifted. Patricia Chen received the encrypted message at 11:47 p.m., but she didn't sleep after reading it. As the CEO of Sterling Global Bank, but more importantly as one of the 7 people who knew exactly who owned the institution, she understood that the notification marked the end of an era and the beginning of something unprecedented. Protocol Omega has been activated, the message read, but the attached files contained instructions that would require her to reveal everything tomorrow morning. Prepare for full disclosure. The masquerade ends at 9 a.m. Execute all attached directives without deviation. The board will be surprised. Patricia had spent the rest of the night in her office, but she'd been making calls to lawyers, accountants, and communications specialists, preparing for the earthquake that would hit Sterling Global Bank in less than 9 hours. At 8:45 a.m., but 15 minutes before the scheduled board meeting, the bank's executive board members began receiving identical packages via secure courier. Each package contained a leather-bound folder, but the contents would fundamentally alter their understanding of who they worked for. James Wellington received his package while sitting in his corner office, but he was still gloating over the divorce papers Rebecca had shown him last night, thinking he'd successfully stolen another man's wife, and that his promotion to senior executive vice president was now guaranteed since Rebecca would certainly advocate for him with her newfound freedom. He opened the package casually, but his expression changed as he read the first page. Confidential. Board member eyes only. RE. Ownership structure of Sterling Global Bank. Effective immediately. Dear board member, you are hereby notified that the true ownership structure of Sterling Global Bank is being disclosed for the first time in the institution's 20-year history. Sterling Global Bank, along with all its subsidiaries, divisions, and assets, valued at approximately $847 billion, is owned by a single individual through various legal entities. The owner's identity has been concealed until now for personal reasons, but circumstances have necessitated full disclosure. The owner will be introducing himself at this morning's board meeting and will be assuming direct operational control of all bank functions. Additionally, but of particular note to certain board members, a comprehensive audit of all executive activities over the past 5 years has been completed, and criminal referrals will be made where appropriate. James Wellington's hands began to tremble, but he forced himself to keep reading. The owner has specifically requested that Executive Vice President James Wellington III be present at this morning's meeting to discuss irregularities discovered in his expense reports, sexual harassment complaints that were improperly suppressed, and embezzlement of approximately $2.4 million over 18 months through falsified vendor contracts. The document continued, but James couldn't focus on the words anymore because his entire world was collapsing around him. Someone had been investigating him, but more than that, Sterling Global Bank had a single owner who'd apparently been operating in complete secrecy for 2 decades. Who could possibly have that kind of wealth and power, but also have the patience to hide it so completely? Part 4. The Revelation. The Sterling Global Bank boardroom occupied the entire 47th floor of the tower in downtown Manhattan, but its floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city that James Wellington had often imagined would one day be his to command as he climbed even higher in the corporate hierarchy. This morning, but as he entered the room at 8:58 a.m., with the damning document still clutched in his sweating hands, those windows felt less like a promise and more like a threat, as if the city itself was preparing to witness his humiliation. Every board member was present, but their faces showed the same confused anxiety that James felt. Patricia Chen stood at the head of the table, but her expression was professionally neutral, revealing nothing. At exactly 9 a.m., but as the antique grandfather clock in the corner began to chime, the boardroom doors opened again. Thomas Reed walked in wearing a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, but it was the same man James had seen exactly once before, 3 years ago, when he'd attended Rebecca Martinez's small, embarrassingly modest wedding at a courthouse. James had been invited because Rebecca and he had already been working together at the bank then, but he'd thought nothing of the quiet, unremarkable man Rebecca was marrying, dismissing him as another of the forgettable nobodies who populated the edges of his world. "Good morning," Thomas said, but his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 20 years building empires from shadows. "I'm Thomas Reed. I own Sterling Global Bank. I own this building. I own the chairs you're sitting in, but more importantly, I own the futures of everyone in this room. And it's time we had a conversation about what happens next." The silence that followed was absolute, but James Wellington's mind was racing through impossible calculations, trying to reconcile the warehouse worker Rebecca had mocked last night with the trillionaire who was now standing at the head of the boardroom table. "Many of you are wondering why I've concealed my ownership for so long," Thomas continued, but he was pulling up a presentation on the room's massive display screen. "The answer is simple. I wanted to build something real, something that wasn't corrupted by the usual dynamics of wealth and power. I wanted to see if people could be judged by their character rather than their bank accounts, but I also wanted to understand how my organizations functioned from the inside." Charts appeared on the screen, but they showed a corporate structure so complex that several board members gasped. Sterling Global Bank was revealed to be just one piece of a massive conglomerate that included technology companies, real estate empires, pharmaceutical corporations, and media holdings that collectively represented one of the world's largest concentrations of private wealth. "Over the past 20 years, Thomas said, but his eyes swept across the room with the practiced assessment of someone used to evaluating people's weaknesses. "I've worked in various capacities within my own organizations. I've been a programmer at my tech companies, a janitor at my office buildings, a driver for my logistics operations, and most recently, a warehouse worker at the distribution center that supplies this very building." He paused, but the weight of his revelation was still settling over the room like a smothering blanket. "I did this because I wanted to understand how my employees were treated, but I also wanted to see who among my executives was worthy of the trust I'd placed in them, and who was simply a parasite, feeding on the empire I built while contributing nothing but corruption and cruelty. Thomas's gaze finally settled on James Wellington, but his expression showed no anger, only a cold assessment that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. "Mr. Wellington," Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried clearly through the silent room. "Would you like to explain to the board why you've been embezzling money from this institution, or should I let the prosecutors who are waiting outside do it for you?" James tried to speak, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper. I don't—" "The full audit is in your folders," Thomas told the other board members, but he was advancing a slide that showed detailed evidence of James's crimes. Mr. Wellington created 17 shell vendors, approved their invoices himself through an abuse of his executive authority, and collected the payments through accounts registered to his elderly mother, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, but whose identity he continues to exploit. The evidence was overwhelming, but Thomas wasn't finished. He's also been sexually harassing junior staff members, and when complaints were filed, he used his position to have them buried in HR, but I've been maintaining separate documentation of every incident. Additionally, and this is perhaps most relevant to today's proceedings, Mr. Wellington has been conducting an affair with my wife, or rather, my soon-to-be ex-wife, for approximately 8 months, but he's been doing so while using company resources, company time, and company credit cards to fund their relationship. A new slide appeared, but this one showed photographs. James and Rebecca at expensive restaurants, James and Rebecca at luxury hotels, James and Rebecca shopping at boutiques where a single outfit cost more than most people earned in a month. Every image was time-stamped and location tagged, but more damning, every image showed transactions made with Sterling Global Bank corporate accounts that James had falsely classified as business expenses. "Mr. Wellington," Thomas said, but now 2 security officers were entering the room. "You're fired, effective immediately. Your access to all Sterling Global Bank systems has been revoked. Your corporate cards have been canceled, and the apartment the bank was providing you as an executive benefit is being repossessed as we speak. The prosecutors outside will be charging you with embezzlement, fraud, and several other felonies that carry significant prison time, but I wanted you to understand who was ultimately responsible for your arrest." James finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate, pleading whine. "Thomas, please, I didn't know. Rebecca never said, 'We can work something out. I'll pay back every cent.' The time for working things out was before you decided to steal from me, but more importantly, before you participated in betraying me in my own marriage while collecting a salary from my bank. Take him out." The security officers moved forward, but James was babbling now, apologies and explanations pouring out in an incoherent stream as he was escorted from the boardroom, but Thomas had already moved on, advancing to the next slide. "As for the rest of you," he told the remaining board members, but his tone became businesslike, almost conversational. "Your positions are secure, assuming you've been performing your duties with integrity. We have a lot of work to do. Sterling Global Bank is about to undergo a massive expansion, but we'll be doing it with a clear understanding of who's in charge and what our values actually are." Patricia Chen spoke for the first time, but her voice carried relief. "The staff will have questions about the transition. How would you like me to address them?" "With honesty," Thomas said simply. "Tell them that the bank's owner has chosen to step out of the shadows, but assure them that nothing changes in terms of their employment or compensation. In fact, announce that we're instituting a company-wide raise of 15% effective immediately, but also announce that we're implementing new ethics oversight programs that will make it impossible for anyone to exploit their position the way Mr. Wellington did." One of the other board members, but an older man named Robert Harrison, who served as chief financial officer, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, if I may ask, why reveal yourself now? What changed?" Thomas was silent for a moment, but when he spoke, there was something almost vulnerable in his voice, a crack in the armor he'd maintained throughout the presentation. "What changed," he said quietly, but with absolute finality, "is that I got divorced yesterday. On my birthday, my wife served me papers so she could marry Mr. Wellington, who she believed was wealthy and successful. But she had no idea that the man she was leaving owned everything her lover had been fraudulently enjoying. The universe has a sense of irony, gentlemen and ladies, but I've decided to embrace it fully. My private life is over. My anonymity is over. It's time to build something new from the ruins of what I thought I had." The board meeting continued for another 2 hours, but the foundation had been set. Thomas Reed was no longer hiding, and the empire he'd built in secret was about to reshape the world in ways even he couldn't fully predict yet. But before any of that could happen, there were other debts to settle. Part 5. The dominoes begin to fall. Rebecca Martinez had spent the morning in what she thought was the beginning of her perfect new life. But she was about to discover that the universe had other plans. She'd woken up at 6 a.m. in James's luxury apartment, the one she didn't know was actually owned by Sterling Global Bank, and had gotten ready for work with a sense of profound satisfaction, thinking that she'd finally escaped the mediocrity of Thomas Reed and his pathetic existence. She'd heard her phone ringing multiple times while she was in the shower, but she'd ignored it, thinking it was probably Thomas calling to beg her to reconsider, except Thomas had never been the type to beg, and that should have been her first warning. When she finally checked her messages at 8:30 a.m., but while applying makeup that cost more per ounce than gold, she found 17 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and 34 text messages, but they weren't from Thomas. They were from her parents, her brother Marcus, her colleagues at Sterling Global Bank, and several numbers she didn't recognize, but they all said essentially the same thing. Something catastrophic had happened, and she needed to call immediately. Rebecca's first call was to her brother, but Marcus Martinez's voice was barely controlled panic when he answered. "Rebecca, what the hell did you do?" he demanded, but before she could respond, he was already continuing. "Dad's restaurant is being foreclosed on. Mom's medical credit line has been called in immediately, and I just got a notice that my law school loans, the ones that Thomas supposedly paid off for me 2 years ago, were never actually paid, but instead were being carried as private debt by some company I've never heard of, and now they're demanding full payment of $240,000 within 30 days, or they're taking legal action." Rebecca's mind was struggling to process what she was hearing, but she managed to stammer, "That's impossible. Thomas paid those off. I saw the bank transfers." "Apparently," Marcus said, but his voice was acidic. "Thomas was the one lending us the money all along, but he was doing it through some kind of trust or company, and now someone's calling in all the debts at once. Rebecca, Dad's going to lose his restaurant. Mom's going to have collectors hounding her while she's undergoing chemotherapy, and I'm going to be financially destroyed before I even take the bar exam. What did you do?" Rebecca ended the call, but her hands were shaking as she dialed the number for Sterling Global Bank's main switchboard, demanding to speak with James Wellington immediately. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, but her voice carried an odd strain. "Mr. Wellington is no longer with Sterling Global Bank. His employment was terminated this morning, but I can transfer you to his replacement if you'd like." The words didn't make sense, but Rebecca was insisting on more information when she heard the apartment door opening behind her. She turned, but instead of James, 2 men in suits were entering, followed by a property manager she vaguely recognized. "Ms. Martinez," one of the men said, but he was holding up a badge. "I'm Detective Morrison with the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit. We need to ask you some questions about your relationship with James Wellington III and your knowledge of his financial activities at Sterling Global Bank. The next 6 hours, but hours that felt like 6 years, were a blur of interrogations, revelations, and the systematic dismantling of everything Rebecca had thought she understood about her life. The detectives informed her that James had been arrested for embezzlement, but they wanted to know if she'd been complicit in his crimes. She'd sworn she knew nothing, but the photographs they'd shown her, images of her and James at restaurants and hotels, all paid for with embezzled funds, made her an unwitting accomplice at minimum, and potentially a co-conspirator at worst. She'd learned that the luxury apartment wasn't James's personal property, but rather a corporate benefit from Sterling Global Bank that had been immediately revoked when he was fired, and she had 24 hours to remove her belongings before locks were changed. But the worst revelation, but the one that made Rebecca's entire world collapse around her, like a house of cards in a hurricane, came when the detectives had almost casually mentioned who had actually been behind James's arrest. Thomas Reed, Detective Morrison had said, but he'd been checking his notes as if the name was just another detail in a routine case. He's the owner of Sterling Global Bank. Apparently he's been conducting an undercover investigation of his own executives for years, but he decided to move forward with prosecutions this morning. You know him. Rebecca had gone completely white, but she'd managed to whisper, "He's my husband." Ex-husband, according to the divorce papers filed last night, the detective had corrected, but his expression had shifted to something almost pitying. "You didn't know who you were married to, did you?" The answer that Rebecca could barely admit even to herself, was that she hadn't known anything. She'd married a man who'd presented himself as a warehouse worker, but she'd never bothered to look deeper, never questioned how he could afford to lend her family $40,000 here, $30,000 there, never wondered why he'd been so knowledgeable about finance and business, despite supposedly working minimum wage. She'd seen what she'd wanted to see, a failure, a disappointment, someone beneath her. But the truth was that Thomas Reed had been testing her all along, and she'd failed spectacularly. By the time Rebecca left the police station, but with warnings not to leave the city while the investigation continued, the sun was setting over Manhattan, and she had nowhere to go. James's apartment was being repossessed, but she couldn't go back to the apartment she'd shared with Thomas because she'd already signed it over in the divorce agreement, and her parents' house was 3 hours upstate, but even that was under threat of foreclosure. She called James's phone 17 times, but it went straight to voicemail, and she finally understood that she was completely, utterly alone. But she'd done it to herself. Part 6. The Cost of Betrayal. 3 weeks after the board meeting that changed everything, but 3 weeks that had been filled with media frenzy as the world discovered that one of the largest hidden fortunes in history had been concealed by a man who'd spent years working as a janitor and warehouse employee in his own companies. Thomas Reed stood in his new office at Sterling Global Bank's headquarters, but he was looking out at the city with an expression that mixed triumph and profound sadness. The empire he'd built was no longer secret, but the revelation had transformed him from an anonymous trillionaire into one of the most famous people on the planet. Forbes had immediately put him at number 7 on their billionaire list, but they'd estimated his wealth conservatively at $147 billion because the full extent of his holdings was still being uncovered. Patricia Chen entered the office, but she carried a tablet with updates that Thomas had requested about the aftermath of his revelation. James Wellington was sentenced yesterday, she reported, but her voice was professionally neutral. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution of the embezzled funds, but since he's already bankrupt from legal fees and seized assets, he'll be paying that debt for the rest of his life. He's also been disbarred from ever working in financial services again. Thomas nodded, but he felt no satisfaction, only a kind of empty completion, as if checking an item off a list. "Rebecca Martinez?" he asked quietly. "Not charged," Patricia said, but she consulted her tablet for the details. The prosecutors determined she had no knowledge of Wellington's embezzlement scheme, but she's been fired from Sterling Global Bank for violating ethics policies regarding relationships with superiors and accepting gifts that violated corporate guidelines. She's applied for positions at 17 other financial institutions, but once they run background checks and discover her connection to the Wellington scandal, none of them call her back. And her family? Patricia hesitated, but Thomas's expression told her he wanted complete honesty. Her father's restaurant was foreclosed on when the private loans you'd extended were called in, but the property was purchased by one of your subsidiary real estate companies and is being redeveloped into luxury condos. Her mother's medical debt was also called in, but Mrs. Martinez declared bankruptcy to protect her remaining assets, though the stress apparently worsened her health condition significantly. Marcus Martinez is working 3 jobs to pay off his law school loans, but at the current payment rate, he'll be debt-free in approximately 18 years. Thomas was silent, but his jaw tightened slightly. "You requested updates on Rebecca's current situation as well," Patricia continued, but her voice softened slightly. "She's living in a studio apartment in Queens, working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, making $43,000 a year, but she's struggling to make rent because of her own legal fees from the investigation. She's apparently been trying to contact you, but your security team has blocked all her calls and messages per your instructions." "Keep them blocked," Thomas said, but there was no heat in his voice, only exhaustion. "What's done is done, but I have no interest in reopening old wounds." Patricia nodded, but she had one more item. "The media requests are still coming in at a rate of about 200 per day, but they all want the same thing. They want to know why you hid your wealth, why you worked menial jobs, and what you're planning to do now that you're public. Some of them are specifically asking about your marriage and divorce, but we've been declining all interview requests as you instructed." "Continue doing so," Thomas said, but then he turned away from the window to face Patricia directly. "I didn't hide my wealth to create a dramatic reveal, and I didn't work those jobs as some kind of publicity stunt. I did it because I wanted to understand the world I was shaping through my investments and decisions, but I also wanted to find out if anyone could love me for who I was rather than what I had." "Did you find your answer?" Patricia asked gently. Thomas smiled, but it was a sad, knowing expression that held decades of wisdom earned through pain. "Yes, but not the one I wanted. Rebecca couldn't love a warehouse worker, no matter what his character or intelligence, because she'd been taught that success was measured in dollars and status symbols. She saw my humble presentation as failure rather than choice, but she never considered that someone might voluntarily live simply while commanding billions." He paused, but he was returning to the window now, looking down at the city that bustled far below, full of people who were all struggling in their own ways to find meaning and security. "The tragedy," Thomas continued, but his voice was almost a whisper, "is that I gave her every opportunity to see past the surface. I was kind, I was supportive, I helped her family without asking for recognition, but none of it mattered because I didn't perform wealth in the way she'd been conditioned to recognize it. So she left me for a man who wore expensive suits and drove a Tesla, but never bothered to check whether his wealth was real or borrowed or, in James's case, stolen." "Do you regret revealing yourself?" Patricia asked, but she already knew the answer. "No," Thomas said firmly, but he straightened his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Hiding was its own kind of prison, and I'm tired of living in disguise. The world knows who I am now, but that means I can finally build something that reflects my actual values rather than maintaining a fiction. Sterling Global Bank is going to become a model for what capitalism can be when it's not corrupted by greed and exploitation, but I'm also going to use my wealth to address the kinds of problems that governments and traditional philanthropy have failed to solve. Over the following months, but in a transformation that was watched by millions of people around the world, Thomas Reed became one of the most influential figures in global business and philanthropy. He used his wealth to fund revolutionary medical research, but he also invested billions in education programs that provided free college tuition to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Sterling Global Bank became known for its ethical practices, but also for its innovation in finding ways to provide financial services to underserved communities. Thomas personally worked with regulators to develop new frameworks for corporate governance that prevented the kind of abuse that James Wellington had perpetrated. But he also became an advocate for workers' rights, using his own experiences in menial jobs to push for better wages and conditions across all his companies. The media called him the Trillionaire janitor, but Thomas accepted the nickname as a badge of honor, a reminder that work had dignity regardless of its pay scale, and that the people who cleaned floors and stocked shelves were every bit as important as the executives who made million-dollar decisions. Part 7. The Hollow Victory. Rebecca Martinez sat in her tiny studio apartment in Queens, but she was watching a news broadcast about Thomas Reed's latest philanthropic initiative, a billion-dollar fund to help families dealing with medical debt and business failures, specifically targeting situations where private loans had been called in unexpectedly. The irony wasn't lost on her, but irony couldn't pay the rent that was 3 weeks overdue, or replace the career she'd destroyed through her own arrogance and blindness. She'd tried writing to Thomas dozens of times, but every letter had been returned unopened, and eventually she'd stopped trying because what could she possibly say that would change anything? She'd betrayed him on his birthday, mocked him for being poor while he was secretly supporting her entire family, and left him for a criminal who'd been stealing from the bank Thomas actually owned. The universe had delivered justice, but justice felt less like vindication and more like a crushing weight that pressed down on her every moment of every day. Her phone rang, but it was Marcus, and she almost didn't answer because she knew what he was going to say. Another update about their family's continued struggles, another reminder that she'd been the catalyst for their collective downfall. "Rebecca," Marcus said when she finally picked up, but his voice lacked the anger it had carried for weeks after the revelations. "I got a strange letter today from a law firm representing something called the Reed Family Trust." Rebecca's heart stopped, but she forced herself to ask, what did it say? It said that Dad's restaurant property has been transferred back to him, free and clear, but with a stipulation that he can never sell it to developers and has to maintain it as a community restaurant for at least 20 years. Mom's medical debt has been forgiven entirely, but paid off by the trust with instructions that the discharge shouldn't appear on her credit report. And my law school loans. Marcus paused, but Rebecca could hear the emotion in his voice. They've been paid off completely, but with a note that says, education should never be a burden. Succeed with integrity and teach others to do the same. Rebecca was crying now, but they were complicated tears that mixed grief and gratitude and shame in equal measure. "He didn't have to do that," she whispered, but she knew exactly why Thomas had done it, because her family had never been the problem, only she had, and he was punishing her by showing her exactly what she'd thrown away when she'd chosen James Wellington over him. "The letter also included a message for you," Marcus continued, but his voice was gentle now, all the anger finally spent. "It says, tell Rebecca that I hope she finds what she's looking for, But I hope even more that she learns to recognize value when it doesn't come wrapped in expensive packaging. Some lessons cost more than others, but the important thing is learning from them rather than being destroyed by them. I wish her well, but from a distance. TR. After Marcus hung up, but after Rebecca had spent an hour crying until she had no tears left, she sat at her tiny kitchen table and wrote one final letter. But this one she didn't try to send. Instead, she kept it as a reminder, a confession, a memorial to the life she'd destroyed through her own choices. Dear Thomas, I can't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that I finally understand what I had and what I destroyed. You were testing me all along, weren't you? Seeing if I could love you without the money, without the status symbols, without the external validation that I'd been taught meant success. But I failed that test completely. I look back now at the man who baked me a birthday cake, even though he was exhausted from working a double shift, who listened to my complaints about work without ever mentioning that he owned the building I worked in, who helped my family without asking for recognition or gratitude. But all I could see was what you weren't rather than what you were. You were patient and I was cruel. You were genuine, but I was shallow. You were testing for character and I revealed that I had none. The worst part isn't the studio apartment or the minimum wage job or the destroyed career, but rather the knowledge that I had something precious and didn't recognize it until it was gone. You loved me enough to hide billions of dollars just to see if I could love you back, but I loved you so little that I left you for a man who was stealing from you. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I don't know if it matters. You've moved on to changing the world, but I'm stuck in the wreckage of the life I built on false values and shallow priorities. I hope you find someone who can see you clearly, who can love the warehouse worker and the trillionaire as the same person, because they always were. I just wasn't smart enough or mature enough to understand that wealth without character is worthless, but character without wealth is priceless. I'm sorry, Thomas, but I know sorry isn't enough. It will never be enough. Rebecca. She folded the letter carefully, but she put it in a drawer with all the other letters she'd written but never sent. And then she went back to her accounting work. The columns of numbers that were all she had left now that she'd thrown away everything else. Epilogue. The throne that was never empty 5 years after the divorce, but 5 years that had transformed Thomas Reed from a hidden trillionaire into one of the world's most recognized philanthropists and business leaders. He stood at a charity gala in Geneva, Switzerland, but this time he was the keynote speaker rather than a volunteer bartender. The audience of global leaders, fellow billionaires, and non-profit executives hung on his every word, but Thomas was talking about something that few of them wanted to hear: the corrupting influence of wealth and the importance of maintaining human connections that weren't transactional. I spent 3 years of my life pretending to be poor, he told the assembled crowd, but his voice carried the authority of someone who'd walked between two worlds and understood both intimately. Not because I wanted to trick anyone, but because I wanted to answer a simple question. Would anyone love me if they didn't know what I had? The answer I got was painful, but it was necessary, because it taught me that the problem wasn't just that my wife couldn't love a warehouse worker. The problem was that I'd built a society where we measure people by their bank balances rather than their character. The audience was silent, but many of them looked uncomfortable because Thomas's words were striking too close to truths they'd spent their lives avoiding. My ex-wife Rebecca made a choice, Thomas continued, but there was no vindictiveness in his voice, only sad acceptance. She chose status over substance, wealth over character, but she made that choice because that's what society had taught her to value. Yes, she hurt me, but she also revealed a systemic problem. We've created a world where a man working honestly at a warehouse is considered worthless, but a man embezzling millions is considered successful until he gets caught. He paused, but he was looking directly at the audience now, challenging them with his gaze. The empire I built in secret wasn't about hiding my wealth from my wife, but rather about understanding what my wealth actually meant. Every dollar I control represents someone's labor, someone's innovation, someone's hope for a better future. But if I don't understand those people because I've isolated myself in luxury, then I'm not a businessman. I'm just a parasite with better PR. The speech went on for another 30 minutes, but Thomas ended with a challenge that would echo through philanthropic circles for years. Don't measure your success by what you own, but by what you've built that will outlive you. Don't judge others by what they have, but by how they treat people who can do nothing for them. And most importantly, don't mistake the performance of wealth for the reality of character, because one is theater, but the other is truth. After the speech, but as Thomas was leaving the stage to thunderous applause, a young woman approached him. She was plainly dressed, but she carried herself with quiet confidence, and there was intelligence in her eyes that reminded him of someone he'd once known, before that person had been corrupted by ambition and superficial values. "Mr. Reed," she said, but she extended her hand for a simple handshake, rather than the deferential bowing he'd grown tired of. "I'm Elena Kovac. I work at a homeless shelter in Prague, but I'm here representing a coalition of grassroots organizations that need funding. We don't have the polish of the big nonprofits, and we can't promise you naming rights on buildings or galas in your honor. But we can promise you that every dollar will go directly to helping people who've been forgotten by everyone else." Thomas smiled, but it was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that smiles rarely did anymore. "Tell me more, but let's do it over coffee rather than in this ballroom. I've had enough of formal presentations for one night." They talked for 3 hours at a small cafe that Thomas chose specifically because it was the kind of place where nobody would recognize him, but also because its humble atmosphere reminded him of who he'd been before the world had learned his secret. Elena told him about her work, but she also challenged him, questioned whether his philanthropic efforts were actually addressing root causes or just treating symptoms. She was unimpressed by his wealth, but deeply impressed by his apparent willingness to listen. And by the end of the night, Thomas had committed $50 million to her coalition. But he'd also gotten something more valuable, a reminder that there were still people in the world who saw past the money to the person underneath. As they parted ways, but as Elena was heading back to her modest hotel, while Thomas returned to his 5-star accommodation, she paused and looked back at him. "Your ex-wife was an idiot," Elena said simply, but there was no malice in her voice, only factual assessment. "Anyone who couldn't see your value without the billions didn't deserve you with them." Thomas laughed, but it was the first completely unguarded laugh he'd had in 5 years. "She wasn't an idiot, but she was blinded by the wrong things. We all are sometimes, until life teaches us better." "Fair enough," Elena agreed, but she was smiling now too. "But for what it's worth, I think the warehouse worker version of you was probably more interesting than the Trillionaire version. Money makes people boring, but people who've actually worked understand what matters." She left then, but Thomas stood on the Geneva Street corner for a long moment, thinking about Rebecca and James, about empires and betrayals, about thrones that had always been occupied even when nobody could see them, but mostly about the difference between the life he'd thought he wanted and the life he'd actually built. Rebecca had served him divorce papers on his birthday, but she'd been so focused on leaving him for someone she thought was better that she'd never realized the man she was abandoning had been giving her everything she thought she wanted all along. James had believed he was seducing another man's wife, but he'd actually been destroying his own future by stealing from the one person who could have taught him the difference between wealth and worth. And Thomas had built an empire in secret, but he'd learned that the real treasure wasn't the billions of dollars or the power over markets. It was the hard-won wisdom that character could survive poverty, but poverty of character couldn't be fixed with any amount of wealth. The Martinez family had lost everything and then been saved, but not because Thomas was merciful, rather because he understood that Rebecca's parents and brother had been collateral damage in a lesson about betrayal and consequences, and punishing innocent people wasn't justice, it was just cruelty. Rebecca herself had been left to rebuild her life from nothing, but she'd been given the same gift Thomas had given himself when he'd hidden his fortune, the opportunity to discover who she really was when all the artificial supports were stripped away. Whether she would learn from that gift, but whether she would grow into someone who could finally recognize value without the price tag was something only time would tell. As for Thomas Reed, but as he finally headed back to his hotel, through the quiet Geneva streets, he understood something that had eluded him for 47 years. Power wasn't about controlling billions of dollars or commanding empires, but rather about maintaining integrity when everyone else was selling theirs, about remaining kind when the world rewarded cruelty, about seeing value in people regardless of what they could offer in return. He'd worn the disguise of poverty to test his wife, but in doing so he'd discovered something more important. That the man who could be content in worn jeans and a used sedan was the same man who could command $800 billion in assets, and that consistency of character across all circumstances was the only wealth that actually mattered. The throne had never been empty, but it had always been occupied by someone who understood that crowns meant nothing if the person wearing them had forgotten how to be human. And so the trillionaire who'd been poor but who'd always been rich where it counted walked alone into the night, but he carried with him the knowledge that betrayal had brought clarity, divorce had brought freedom, and losing everything false had revealed what was actually true. Rebecca had thought she was trading up, but she'd actually traded everything for nothing. James had thought he was climbing higher, but he'd actually been digging his own grave. And Thomas had thought he was hiding his wealth, but he'd actually been revealing his character to anyone who'd bothered to look past the surface. The story wasn't over, but the lesson had been taught. And somewhere in a studio apartment in Queens, Rebecca Martinez was finally learning what it meant to value things that couldn't be bought or stolen or lost in a market crash, but only earned through the slow, painful process of becoming someone who deserved them. The warehouse worker had been a king all along, but only the king had known it, and by the time everyone else figured it out, the throne had been rebuilt in a shape that reflected not just wealth but wisdom earned through betrayal, pain, and the hard-won understanding that love without truth was just a pretty lie. But truth without love was just cold comfort. The empire stood, but it stood on foundations that couldn't be shaken by divorce papers or embezzlement schemes or the petty betrayals of people who'd mistaken performance for reality. And in the end, but in the only end that mattered, Thomas Reed had bankrupted those who'd betrayed him not through cruelty, but through the simple act of revealing that the poorest man they'd known had been the richest man they'd never really seen. Justice wasn't revenge, but revelation. And sometimes, but just sometimes, the best punishment for not recognizing value was watching it walk away, but only after ensuring that the lesson would never be forgotten. 10 years later, the small community center in Brooklyn was nothing special, just a converted warehouse with peeling paint and mismatched furniture. But Thomas Reed had learned long ago that the most important work happened in places that would never make architectural magazines. He stood at the back of the room during the Tuesday night financial literacy class, but he wasn't there as the famous trillionaire philanthropist. He was there as Tom, the volunteer who'd been teaching basic budgeting skills to single parents and recent immigrants for the past 6 months. Nobody recognized him, but that was intentional. He'd grown a beard, wore reading glasses he didn't need, and dressed in the kind of clothes that screamed middle-aged teacher struggling on a non-profit salary. The disguise was familiar, but this time it wasn't a test. It was a refuge, a way to remember who he'd been before the world had learned his name. "Okay, everyone," said the class instructor, a sharp-witted woman named Maria, who ran the center's economic empowerment programs. "Before we wrap up, I want to introduce someone who's going to share her story about rebuilding after financial disaster. Please welcome Rebecca." Thomas's head snapped up, but his body went rigid as Rebecca Martinez walked to the front of the room. She was 48 now, but she looked older, her face carrying lines that spoke of hard years and harder lessons. She wore simple clothes from Target, but they were clean and professional, and she carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity that was completely different from the arrogant confidence she'd projected 15 years ago. She hadn't seen him yet, but Thomas's mind was racing through calculations. Leave quietly, stay and observe, reveal himself, remain hidden. Before he could decide, Rebecca began speaking. "My name is Rebecca Martinez," she said, but her voice was steady, practiced, as if she'd told this story many times before. 15 years ago, I was a rising executive at one of the biggest banks in the world, making 6 figures wearing designer suits, but I was also one of the most foolish people you'd ever meet. The class was attentive, but several people nodded in recognition of the tone. This was someone who'd fallen and was about to explain how. "I was married to a good man," Rebecca continued, but Thomas saw her hands tremble slightly as she gripped the podium. "A kind man who worked hard, who supported my career, who helped my family when they needed it. But I looked down on him because he didn't fit my picture of what success should look like. He worked at a warehouse, he drove an old car, he lived modestly, and I convinced myself that this meant he was a failure, that I deserved better." She paused, but Thomas could see her gathering courage for what came next. "So I left him. On his birthday, I served him divorce papers so I could marry my boss, a man who seemed wealthy and powerful, but who was actually a criminal stealing from the company we both worked for. Within 3 weeks of leaving my husband, my entire life collapsed. I lost my job. My new relationship was destroyed. My family's finances were ruined because of my choices, and I discovered that the failure I'd left was actually one of the wealthiest men in the world, but he'd been living simply to see if anyone could love him for who he was rather than what he had." The room was completely silent now, but several people had recognized the story. It had been international news a decade ago, but they were seeing it from a new angle, through the eyes of the person who'd become the cautionary tale. "I spent the first 5 years after my divorce angry," Rebecca admitted, but her voice cracked slightly. "Angry at my ex-husband for tricking me, angry at the world for judging me, angry at myself for being so blind, but mostly just angry because anger was easier than admitting I'd destroyed everything good in my life through my own arrogance and materialism." Thomas found himself leaning forward, but he was completely focused on her words now, curious despite himself about what had happened to the woman he'd once loved and ultimately been betrayed by. "Then something shifted," Rebecca said, but she was looking directly at the class now, making eye contact with individuals. "I was working 3 jobs, barely making rent, and I met a woman at the laundromat who was in an even worse situation than me. Single mother, 2 kids, working as a house cleaner while going to nursing school at night. She had every reason to be bitter, but she was kind. She shared her lunch with me, even though she barely had enough for herself. And when I asked her how she stayed positive, she said something that changed my life. You can't change what happened yesterday, but you can decide who you're going to be tomorrow." Rebecca smiled, but it was sad and self-aware, nothing like the sharp, superior expressions Thomas remembered from their marriage. So I decided to become someone different. Not the executive I'd been, but not the victim I'd been playing at either. I went back to school and got certified as a financial counselor, specifically to help people avoid the mistakes I'd made. For the last 8 years, I've been teaching classes just like this one in community centers all over the city, but I also work one-on-one with people who are struggling with debt, teaching them that your bank balance doesn't define your worth and that character matters more than credit scores. She pulled out a worn notebook, but Thomas recognized it immediately. It was the journal he'd given her on their first anniversary, back when he'd still believed their marriage had a future. "I write in this every day," Rebecca said, but she was holding it up so the class could see. "Every morning I write down 3 things, something I'm grateful for, something I learned, and something I need to forgive myself for. Because the truth is, I'm still learning how to be the person I should have been all along. But the only way forward is through honest self-assessment and genuine effort to do better." She looked around the room, but her gaze finally landed on Thomas at the back, and for a moment their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, but she didn't stop speaking, didn't acknowledge him directly. She just continued with her presentation as if this moment had been inevitable all along. "The man I divorced has gone on to do incredible things with his wealth," Rebecca said, but her voice was steady now, professional. "He's funded hospitals and schools, created job programs, changed entire industries to be more ethical and humane. And me, I make $48,000 a year, live in a rent-controlled apartment, and take the subway everywhere, but I'm happier now than I ever was when I was chasing status and money." She closed her notebook, but she held Thomas's gaze across the room. "The lesson I learned, but learned too late to save my marriage, is this. Wealth is just a tool, but character is everything. My ex-husband had both, but I couldn't see the character because I was blinded by the absence of visible wealth. I chose flash over substance, performance over reality, but I paid for that choice with everything I thought I valued. The irony is that once I lost everything, I finally found what actually mattered." The class erupted in applause, but Rebecca was already stepping away from the podium, accepting Maria's thanks and a few questions from students who wanted to know more about her financial counseling services. Throughout it all, but throughout the next 20 minutes of people talking and gathering their things, Rebecca and Thomas kept glancing at each other, but neither approached the other. Finally, but as the room was emptying and Maria was turning off lights, Thomas walked over to where Rebecca was packing her materials into a canvas bag that had definitely seen better days. "Hello, Rebecca," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of 15 years of history. She looked up, but her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Hello, Thomas. Or should I say Tom? I heard you volunteer here under a different name." "Tom is fine," he said, but he was studying her face, looking for traces of the woman he'd married and finding someone completely different. That was a powerful talk. "It's the truth," Rebecca said simply, but she was gripping her bag like a lifeline. "I tell it at least 3 times a week in different community centers. If my mistakes can help even one person avoid destroying their life the way I destroyed mine, then maybe something good came from all that pain." They stood in awkward silence, but Thomas finally gestured to the empty classroom. "Can we talk? Just for a few minutes?" Rebecca nodded, but they sat at one of the student tables, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, creating a bubble of intimacy in the otherwise empty space. "I didn't know you were teaching here," Thomas said, but it wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I didn't know you were volunteering here," Rebecca countered, but she managed a small smile. "Though I suppose we both have a history of hiding in plain sight." Thomas laughed despite himself, but it was brief. "Why financial counseling? You could have done anything after everything." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, but when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. Because I understand exactly how people get trapped by their own bad decisions and wrong priorities. I lived it. I destroyed my marriage, my career, my family's security, all because I believed the lie that success meant money and status instead of integrity and genuine relationships. If I can help even one person see through that lie before they make my mistakes, then maybe I can find some kind of redemption. Redemption, Thomas repeated, but he was turning the word over in his mind like a puzzle piece. From who? From me? From myself, Rebecca said firmly, but she was looking directly at him now. Thomas, I spent 5 years being angry at you for testing me, for tricking me by hiding your wealth. But the truth is, you gave me exactly what I claimed to want. A relationship based on who we were rather than what we had. I failed that test catastrophically, but that wasn't your fault. It was mine. The anger was just a way to avoid admitting that I'd been shallow, materialistic, and cruel to someone who deserved better. Thomas didn't speak, but he was listening with an intensity that made Rebecca nervous. I don't expect your forgiveness, she continued, but her hands were shaking now. I don't expect anything from you except maybe to acknowledge that I've spent 15 years trying to become someone who might have deserved the man you were. Not the trillionaire, the warehouse worker who baked me birthday cakes and listened to my complaints and loved me even when I was being awful. That man deserved better than me, but I'm trying to become someone who might have deserved him. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't hostile. Just heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that might never be recovered. I forgave you years ago, Thomas said finally, but his voice was soft. Not because you asked for it or earned it, but because carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting you to die. I had to let it go for my own peace, but that didn't mean I wanted you back in my life. I understand, Rebecca said, but she was wiping away tears now. I just needed you to know that I'm not the person I was. I'm not asking for another chance or trying to win you back. I know that ship sailed 15 years ago. I just wanted you to know that your test, as painful as it was, taught me something vital, but I learned it too late for us, and hopefully early enough to help other people. Thomas stood, but he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. This is the contact information for my foundation's Community Empowerment Division. They're always looking for experienced financial counselors to work with our programs, but the pay is significantly better than what you're making now, and the benefits are comprehensive. If you're interested, tell them Tom from the Brooklyn Center recommended you. Rebecca picked up the card, but she was staring at it as if it might explode. Thomas, I can't accept charity from you. That would be— It's not charity, Thomas interrupted, but his voice was gentle. It's recognition that you're good at what you do and that you're genuinely helping people. The foundation doesn't hire based on personal history. We hire based on effectiveness and integrity. You've demonstrated both, but if you'd prefer to continue working independently, I understand that too. He moved toward the door, but Rebecca called out to him, Thomas, thank you, not for the job offer, though that's incredibly generous, but for the second chance you gave my family 10 years ago. The restaurant, my mom's medical debt, Marcus's loans. You didn't have to do that, but you did it anyway, and it saved them. My father still talks about you like you're some kind of saint, but he doesn't know I'm the reason you had to save them in the first place. Thomas paused in the doorway, but he didn't turn around. I didn't do it for you, Rebecca. I did it because they were innocent victims of our situation, but they deserved a fresh start. Your father makes excellent tamales. Your mother is a kind woman, and Marcus has become an outstanding public defender who helps people who can't afford legal representation. They've all paid forward what they were given, but that was always the point. And me? Rebecca asked quietly, but she already knew the answer. Did I deserve a fresh start? Thomas finally turned to look at her, but his expression was unreadable. Everyone deserves a fresh start, Rebecca, but whether they take advantage of it or waste it is up to them. You've spent 15 years rebuilding yourself into someone who helps others avoid your mistakes. That's admirable, but it doesn't erase what happened. It just means you learned from it. We can't change the past, but we can decide who we're going to be going forward. He smiled slightly, but it was sad. Someone wise once told me that. I think you quoted her in your talk tonight. Rebecca laughed through her tears, but it was genuine. She really did change my perspective, but I've spent a decade trying to pay forward what she gave me that day in the laundromat. Then keep doing that, Thomas said simply, but he was opening the door now. Help people, teach them, give them the wisdom you earned through hard experience. That's worth more than any amount of money I could give you, but if you want to do it through my foundation with better resources and wider reach, the offer stands. He left then, but Rebecca sat alone in the empty classroom for another hour, holding the business card and her worn journal, thinking about the throne she'd abandoned and the warehouse worker who'd been a king all along, but mostly about the woman she'd been and the woman she was trying to become. 2 months later, Thomas was in his office at Sterling Global Bank's headquarters when Patricia Chen knocked on his door, but she was smiling in a way that suggested interesting news. "You're going to want to see this," she said, but she was pulling up a video on her tablet. "It's from our Brooklyn Community Empowerment Center, Rebecca Martinez's first week teaching our advanced financial planning course." Thomas watched the video, but what he saw surprised him. Rebecca was teaching a class of 30 people, double the usual attendance, and she was doing it with a combination of technical expertise and personal vulnerability that made the material accessible and compelling. She shared her own story not as a warning of what not to do, but as proof that recovery was possible, that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, but only if people were willing to do the hard work of changing. She's received the highest participant feedback scores in the program's history, Patricia reported, but she was clearly impressed. People are requesting her specifically, and we've had to add extra sessions to accommodate demand. She's also developing a curriculum for teaching financial literacy to teenagers, but she's focusing specifically on helping them understand that their worth isn't tied to their wealth. Thomas nodded slowly, but he was still watching the video, seeing traces of the intelligent woman he'd married underneath the layers of hard-won wisdom and genuine humility. "Recommend her for program director when Davis retires next quarter," he said quietly, but his eyes never left the screen. "She's earned it, but make sure she knows it's based on merit, not history." Patricia made a note, but she was studying Thomas's face carefully. "Are you sure about this? Having her in a leadership position means you'll cross paths occasionally at foundation events and board meetings." "I'm sure," Thomas said, but he finally looked away from the video. "Rebecca destroyed our marriage through her own choices, but she spent 15 years rebuilding herself into someone who genuinely helps people. That's exactly the kind of person who should be leading our community programs. But I won't let ancient history prevent the foundation from having the best possible leadership." He paused, but his expression was thoughtful. "Besides, everyone deserves a chance to prove they've changed, but not everyone takes advantage of that chance the way she has. That's worth acknowledging, but it doesn't mean we're going backward, just that we're both moving forward in our separate ways." Patricia left, but Thomas sat alone in his office, looking out at the city that had witnessed his transformation from hidden trillionaire to public philanthropist, from betrayed husband to someone who'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, but rather about releasing the hold that past pain had on present possibilities. Rebecca would never be his wife again, but she'd become something else. A living example that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define entire lives, but only if people were willing to acknowledge their failures and spend years genuinely working to become better. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined 15 years ago when she'd served him divorce papers on his birthday, but it was perhaps the only ending that honored both the pain of betrayal and the possibility of redemption. The warehouse worker had been a king, but the queen who'd abandoned him had become a teacher, and sometimes that was its own kind of royalty. Not the kind that commanded empires, but the kind that changed individual lives. One conversation, one class, one moment of honest vulnerability at a time. The throne remained occupied by someone who'd learned that wealth without character was poverty, but character without wealth was richness, and somewhere in Brooklyn, a woman who'd once believed the opposite was teaching others what she'd learned too late for herself, but just in time for the people who might still be saved from making her mistakes. Justice had been served, but mercy had been granted, and in the space between those two truths, but in that narrow corridor where punishment met possibility, two people who'd once destroyed each other had found a way to exist in the same world, without either seeking revenge or reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something harder and more complex. The acknowledgement that people were capable of both terrible betrayals and genuine transformation, but that recognizing one didn't erase the other. It just meant accepting that human beings were more complicated than simple stories of heroes and villains allowed. The empire stood, but it was built now not just on wealth or power, but on the understanding that everyone deserved a second chance. But nobody was owed a relationship with the people they'd betrayed. And sometimes the greatest gift was simply allowing someone to prove they'd learned and grown, but from a distance that respected the boundaries that broken trust had created. The story wasn't over, but it had found a resting place, a temporary equilibrium where the past's pain didn't prevent the present's possibilities, but also didn't pretend that time alone could heal wounds that required genuine transformation to even begin to address. And in that careful balance, but in that honest acknowledgement of what had been lost and what might yet be built, Thomas Reed and Rebecca Martinez had found something neither had expected. Not reconciliation, but perhaps something equally valuable, the ability to move forward without being trapped by what had come before, but also without forgetting the lessons those experiences had taught. The warehouse worker remained a king, but the woman who'd left him had become a teacher, and the kingdom they'd once shared had transformed into separate territories that sometimes, occasionally, overlapped in the service of something larger than either of their individual stories. It was messy and imperfect and nothing like a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and sometimes real was worth more than perfect. The throne was occupied, the lessons were learned, and the second chances nobody expected had arrived, but not in the form of romantic reunions or tearful reconciliations, rather in the quiet, undramatic work of becoming better versions of themselves, separately, but with occasional recognition that growth was possible even after catastrophic failure. That was its own kind of ending, but it was also its own kind of beginning, and maybe that was enough.